You're listening to The Narrow Mind, show 819, June 21st, 2007, interview with Steve Kline in response to John MacArthur's sermon, The Christian's Responsibility in a Pagan Society.
You're traveling through another dimension, a dimension not only of sight and of sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of the imagination. There's a signpost up ahead. Your next stop, The Narrow Mind.
Welcome, folks, once again. All of you Narrow Mind addicts out there. And if you are listening live right now, and I know some of you are truly a Narrow Mind addict, because we are broadcasting at a very unusual time. And you would have only known about that if you had been subscribed to the Narrow Mind Update email group. If you're wondering what that is, that's an email group that serves as an announcement kind of forum for what's going on in the Narrow Mind. If you haven't subscribed to that, it's real easy to do. Just go over to the homepage at unchainedradio.com. Click on the nuclear green mailbox there, and you can get signed up right away. Actually, the link below the mailbox. And that way you'll be informed on what's going on in the Narrow Mind. I send out a weekly schedule, and then when we have schedule changes or special guests that book at the last minute, I also send out updates so that our listening audience can be aware of what's going on, so that you can be sure and catch the things that are of interest to you and stay plugged into the Narrow Mind. So we're glad that you joined us once again. It is a Thursday morning. It's about 12 minutes after the hour of 10 o'clock here, 10 a.m. on the West Coast. And I know many of you are going to be listening to this via the podcast. If you're not an annual subscriber and you're listening via the podcast, you're actually listening to a very low-quality podcast file. One of the perks, if you will, for being an annual subscriber is that you receive a feed to the high-quality podcast. In addition to that, you receive full access to the archive that has hundreds of hours of radio, debate, and teaching by yours truly. And you'll also receive a copy of my book, The Baptism Cult. So if you haven't signed up, the May special is $39.99. That's down from $50. And when you become an annual subscriber, you actually help pay the bills here at unchainedradio.com. This is a labor of love for me. I don't get paid to do this. And so your help, your partnership is much appreciated. All right, let's get down to business. As I mentioned at the top of the program, we're going to be discussing a sermon that was preached by John MacArthur. It doesn't look like the original dates here. I've got a copy of the transcript. The title of the sermon was The Christian's Responsibility in a Pagan Society. And I received an email yesterday from a good friend of mine, Steve Kline, and I'd like to introduce him to you. Steve Kline is here in studio with me this morning. Steve Kline, welcome to the program.
Gene, it's great to be in your garage with you. I appreciate it. It is a privilege. Thank you very much. And I apologize beforehand. I know I'm going to say some things that offend people. My point is not to offend you. It's to share Jesus with you. It's to share the truth about Jesus and that Jesus is sovereign, and it's all about Jesus.
Okay, why don't you begin by telling us a little bit about your background as a Christian, some of the things that you've been involved in.
I've been saved about 10 years. About 10 years ago when I got saved, I started praying what I could do. And as I prayed and I studied my Bible, the Lord brought it out to me that I do know a lot about the First Amendment and the Constitution. My degree is in political science, that I do understand authority and lawful orders and obedience and disobedience, specifically civil disobedience. And so as a result of that, I went out and began helping the pro-life movement, who is getting literally arrested and beaten up, and showed them how to work as Nehemiah and Paul did, using due process, sending out letters as Nehemiah did to the civil magistrate and to the cavalry or the chief of police, the city attorney, and coordinating efforts out there to go and share the gospel with kids at high schools, abortion clinics, busy streets, Disneyland, and things of that nature. After that came 9/11, and a number of the people who were going out with me, and by the way, we never had anyone arrested, battered, or anything of that nature. We had high school newspapers writing positive articles about us, saying that while they didn't agree with our message, they agreed with how we exercised the First Amendment and our constitutional privileges that are given to us. And so there was Middle East Christians who were coming out with us on these engagements, sharing the gospel on the streets, at high schools, in front of abortion clinics, and they came up to me and said, would this work in front of a mosque? And I said, absolutely. So we started doing it in front of mosques. And I was shocked as I went out to the mosques and began talking to Muslims, and I could tell from my military experience, having been in open warfare and been around the military-type enemies and friendlies as a young man, that a lot of these guys were clearly terrorists and had killed people in Palestine, Afghanistan, Iraq, and places of that nature. And while we were sharing the gospel with them, it was pretty monumental that we were privileged enough to have the police there to protect us so we could get the gospel out. Through the course of this, we have sued 5 different jurisdictions over abridgment of the First Amendment. And my team of attorneys, 3 of them, have probably granted about $500,000 pro bono to us on doing these outreaches. Once again, we've never been arrested. We just instigated our 5th lawsuit several days ago. I can't talk about that, but I can talk about the prior lawsuits, and we do them all biblically. We've won 3 out of 4. We're in appeals court. On the 4th one, we have 2 more lawsuits we'll instigate in front of and in the midst of terrorists, probably in September. And we do this in accordance with the Bible, and it's been a real privilege to be able to sit on the witness stand in front of a federal judge and actually talk about the Bible, and he listens to it and asks us, why did you do that? And we read directly from the Bible, and he admits it as evidence. It's very powerful. It's a gift that was given to us, and I believe as Jesus shed his blood for our liberty, eternal liberty, so we are tasked today with the vigilance of keeping that liberty alive today. And that's why I was so concerned about the article that I read that John MacArthur would disobey in the fashion that he is.
Okay, and I'm looking at the email that you sent me, and there is a picture of John MacArthur, and there's a picture of Arafat, and it says, John MacArthur of Grace to You Ministries writes, we should help those who work to enslave Christians under Islamic law. Here's an example. Christians warned, accept Islamic law. Now, where did John MacArthur say that we are to help those that are under Islamic law, or we are to accept Islamic law?
Right. In the article that you have in front of you, somewhere around page 17 or thereabouts, he makes a very surprising statement, and he says that we should disobey. I'm doing this on purpose because he thinks he's obeying, but I think he's disobeying. He says we have to obey Hitler and Stalin and other people of this nature. And in other words, he says we have to obey mass murders. No matter what Stalin or Hitler or the civil magistrate tells us to do, we have no choice in the matter but to do it. And in my opinion, that's disobedience.
Well, and
I'll give you an example.
I don't think MacArthur's position is that whatever they tell us to do, that we have no choice but to do it.
No, that's clearly in the quote there. When you find it, I think you'll agree with me. It says it makes no difference who it is, Hitler or Stalin. He names off some other people there, but he says you must do what they tell you to do.
Well, he would also qualify that by saying that you never do anything that is opposed to God's law. In other words, if the government commands you to do something that is in opposition to God's law, then you are under obligation to keep God's law rather than obey an evil leader.
I never saw that in the article. I've read it several times. I've written on it several times. And once again, I would say that if he said that, I would have no problems with it. And in fact, the laws of our land tell us in the Declaration of Independence, my degree being in political science, once again, the Declaration of Independence is the foundation and the basis of our Constitution. In fact, I have also, this is from the Defense Department in 1955. I'm showing it to Gene. You can't see it. Moral Leadership, the Protection of Moral Standards and Character Education Program. It's an official publication from the Department of Defense, published about 1955. And it was signed off by all 5 branches of the service, including the Coast Guard. And down here it says, I'm going to quote this, moral law, often called natural law, does not change. In fact, natural law, if you go back to the Puritan writers, that's what they called the 10 Commandments, the law written on your heart. It is not part of soteriology. It has something to do with law and the basis of law. It is in the very nature of things that is written in the hearts of all men everywhere. This is an official Department of Defense publication. It is the same law saying the same thing to everyone at all times all over the world. Human law and social customs must conform to it, or they are wrong and invalid. Neither personal opinion nor circumstances can change it. It binds on both sides of the international line. The basic teaching of the natural moral law is do good and avoid evil. The codified form of the natural moral law is the Ten Commandments. And I'm reading that right from that publication. So I would say, from what I've read, what John MacArthur published, and I did send him an email about it when he first sent that out, and he did not respond, though I did see that they took it off their site. I would say that I am obeying, and he is disobeying. And here's my point. Before I was allowed to go into combat in Vietnam as a young 18-year-old, for 5 days, we went over the Ten Commandments. We went over what is a lawful order, what is an unlawful order. Now, we know that in Temecula, where Gene lives, that Gene has to adhere to the laws of Temecula. And the laws of Temecula have to adhere to the laws of the county of Riverside, and subsequently to the laws of California, and eventually to the Constitution of the United States, and if you believe in the United Nations, which I don't, then to the United Nations. But above all of that, it's all about Jesus, Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And we go to his 10 Commandments. Before I could kill somebody in Vietnam, I had to make sure that I had executed due process, that I had indeed, though it might be a millisecond, I had to do things in accordance with the Constitution based on the 10 Commandments, to love my neighbor as myself, to love my enemy. And so I had to follow only lawful orders. For example, the general, who can only become a general with congressional approval, and the reason it takes congressional approval is because he's so powerful. He's a governor in his own right. He might be in charge of 60,000 men, or like MacArthur, in charge of all of Japan. But if a general walked up to me, whom I have to obey, I have no choice but to obey the general, and he told me to murder someone, if I obey him, then I am disobeying the law of the land. That's why I'm so upset about what John MacArthur wrote. Ephesians 6:1, children, obey your parents. It's the same language as Romans 13:1, where you have to be subject to your governing authority. Colossians 3:22, obey all things that your masters give you if you're a slave. Titus 3:1, obey magistrates. Hebrews 13:17, obey them. Well, that's all good and well, but my wife has to submit to me. But that does not give me license to tell her to go out and beat up people or murder people. You see, I'm under the jurisdiction of God and Jesus. I can only issue lawful orders, and she can only obey lawful orders. If I tell her to go out and kill somebody and she obeys me, she's disobeying God. If John MacArthur writes that we have to obey mass murderers like Hitler and Stalin no matter what, then he is disobeying, not me. Because all law has to be written in accordance with the law of God. And from Calvin's Institutes, the very last paragraph of his 80 chapters, his 4 books of the Institutes, he finishes it. The first 79 chapters of the Institutes of Calvin have little or nothing to do with government. The last chapter is on civil government. That's interesting. 79 chapters about the Bible leading up to civil government. The very last paragraph written in John MacArthur's The Institutes, his aphorism, sums up the whole book.
John Calvin. You said John MacArthur.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Gene. That's why Gene and I are friends. By the way, I have been out on the streets with Gene hundreds of times, and he is an ambassador for Christ, a gentleman's gentleman. We have had all kinds of instances, but Gene has always been a gentleman and has a gift and a calling of a quick wit. Well, anyways.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And you earned that, believe me. Aphorism number 100, John Calvin, not John MacArthur. John Calvin writes, the obedience enjoined in subjects does not prevent the interference of any popular magistrates whose office it is to restrain tyrants and to protect the liberty of the people. Our obedience to magistrates ought to be such that the obedience which we owe to the King of Kings shall remain entire and unimpaired. In other words, what he's saying is that when it comes time for us to stand before Jesus and give an accounting of our lives, if we stand there and we say, well, 6 billion people in the world said that infanticide for girl children in China is the law of the land, so therefore I killed the little girls obeying the magistrate, Jesus will say, that is not my law. You didn't obey me. You disobeyed me.
All right. When I mentioned what I thought John MacArthur's position was, and you said I didn't recall reading that in the sermon, we have to understand that this is part one of a series. But what I did was, between that time and now, is I just typed into Google John MacArthur Jr. and civil disobedience. And this is a little blurb that came up that is found on the Grace to You website. It says, "We believe the Scripture teaches that we are to submit to government, even if that government does not function entirely or even primarily by biblical principles. That principle is explicit in Peter's message to servants, 1 Peter 2:18 through 19, which directly follows his more general comments regarding government in verses 13 through 17. And that epistle teaches that the same thing over and over again in varied ways. Submit even if you suffer, because in doing so you identify with Christ and are blessed. There are times when we must obey God rather than man, but we believe that we should disobey the authorities only if they command us to do something directly against God's law." Acts 5:29 in its surrounding context. He goes on to say that is a fine distinction, but it is precisely where the issue lies. If we say that Christians are only required to obey their government when it's functioning by scriptural principles, we then nullify the teaching of Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2. In just about any age of history, especially the time during which those passages were written, the Roman government was as corrupt and as godless as any in history, and yet Paul and Peter told Christians to live in subjection, submit to every ordinance, and honor the king. So we believe that civil disobedience is justified only when government compels us to sin, or when there is no legal recourse for fighting injustice. The reason we draw the line there is simply because all scriptural examples of civil disobedience fall squarely into those two situations. Any other kind of activism has no precedent in the Word of God and violates the spirit of Romans 13. Now, I don't necessarily agree with his last statement about any other kind of activism, but I do agree with what he said about the warrant or the justification for civil disobedience. Were you aware of that was his position, Steve?
Not on that one, because you and I are just discussing that one article there, The Christian's Duty in a Pagan Society. And once again, I would go back to what he wrote there when he says you have to obey Hitler and Stalin. Since I'm an insurance broker, there's a concept in insurance when you have claims, frequency and severity. Frequency means the number of times you have a claim, like a wind blows down a fence or you have to get a towing claim. But severity is so great when a person is killed in an accident or a house completely burns down to the ground. And I thought about that, and you know what? I figured maybe John MacArthur had mitigated what he had written there somewhere else, but I thought the severity of what he wrote is so powerful, and I wrote him that one article. I've never seen him back down on saying that he would obey Hitler or Stalin. That, to me, is too severe to let go.
What about Caesar? Okay, so Paul writes...
Caesar also.
Paul writes in Romans chapter 13, I'm sure a passage that you're very familiar with, that we are to be subject to the authorities that are in place, the governments that are in place.
While you're leaping for it, you used a very good word, authority, and that has to do with lawful order. But go ahead.
Romans 13, starting in verse 1, "Let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, he who resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves."
I would submit that the civil magistrate has opposed God, not us. And once again, the word authority, like an author, he writes down his signature, and you know that he's done that. The authority comes from God, and he's only allowed, like in our government, in America, that's why I read that we're under the 10 Commandments. Under our form of government, and all forms of government, all authority comes from God. Once he tells you, Gene, yes, your wife has to submit to you, but you have to kill your wife or tell your wife to kill your children, then if you obey him, you're disobeying God.
No, I would agree.
Right.
So you, as a Christian, you have the obligation to obey God rather than men, as Peter says in Acts chapter 5.
Even as a pagan, because it's still written on his heart. Romans 1.
Right. No, he's going to be accountable.
Right.
He's going to be accountable himself before God. But we are to submit, let's say, for example, they imposed a 50% income tax. Let's say Caesar imposed that at the time of the New Testament, the apostolic era. Would the Christians then be obligated to pay that tax?
As long as it's in accordance with God's 10 Commandments as the general overall umbrella of civil law, absolutely.
All right.
Go ahead.
We're going to go ahead and take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to actually open up the phone lines. If you've got a question or a comment concerning this subject, feel free to give us a call at 1-800-466-1873. That's toll free, 800-466-1873. All right, welcome back to The Narrow Mind on this Thursday morning here on the West Coast, about 33 minutes after the hour. I probably didn't mention it on this episode of The Narrow Mind yet, but I am going to be traveling out to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I'll be out there on the 20th and the 21st of July, and we're hoping to organize some type of get-together for a Narrow Mind audience. In fact, we're hoping to get on one of the local radio stations there ahead of time and get the word out. I'd like to have a church host a get-together. If you belong to a church that might be willing to open up your facility or their facility, maybe 100 or so seats, I think it would be great to put the word out between now and then on the podcast. And also, if we can get on the radio, put the word out, we'll get together and do some type of apologetics Bible study. And then we'll also go ahead and do a Q&A, and we'll get to meet each other. And we've got a lot of listeners out in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We've even got some in the other areas of Texas, so hopefully they would be willing to drive. I'm going to be driving from here, Southern California. It's going to take 2 days, so I'm hoping to get caught up on some studying on the road, some reading, and some podcast listening myself. So hopefully, as time progresses, if you're interested in hosting that or being a part of that or helping me organize that, and you live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, please send me an email. You can send it to unchainedradio@unchainedradio.com. I'd love to hear from you. And we're talking to Steve Kline this morning, and we're talking about our responsibility as Christians living in a pagan society. And the interview was really prompted by an email that I received from Steve. And one thing that I've come to learn doing this show now, going on over 4 years I've been doing this program, is that if I'm not very careful with my facts, people call me on it. And so I'm a lot more careful than I was in the beginning. And so I thought maybe when I read Steve's email that maybe he might be overreacting. And so that's why I invited him here to talk to us about that this morning. Now, in MacArthur's sermon, and this is a transcript from MacArthur's sermon, and I think that this is what you were referring to, Steve. He says, "Now listen to this. It doesn't matter whether your ruler is Caesar, Herod, Pilate, Felix, Festus, Agrippa, Stalin, Hitler, Winston Churchill, Bill Clinton. It doesn't matter who it is. He says, be subject. You teach them to be subject." Now, when you read that, because I think this is probably the main part of the sermon that prompted your response, how did you understand what he was saying? Did you understand him to mean that subject in every aspect of life? In other words, you can't question anything he commands you?
I did it just as if I was on deposition and trial or in a First Amendment court in front of a federal judge. What he wrote is what he meant.
Okay.
I took his literal words there. I have read both parts of that several times, and from what I can glean, that's what he means. Okay,
but I got to tell you, there's nothing here that I would disagree with in the context. I do think that we are to be in subjection to guys like Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and Agrippa and Stalin. But a guy like John MacArthur, I mean, when you get up as a pastor and you preach for 45 minutes on Sunday morning, you can't really give all the disclaimers to everything you say. This is part of the problem of preaching. Because what happens is you'll say something, but you want it to, for example, when I was preaching through the book of Hebrews, I did 46 messages on the book of Hebrews. Some of the messages, because I was preaching exegetically, really emphasized the grace of God and the completeness of what God had done. But then you've got these other warning passages in the text also. And so I had to constantly be reminding people, look, when you come in, you're hearing a sermon that is part of a book that was meant to be read in one sitting. The book of Hebrews was, in fact, a sermon itself. And so I said, because we're slicing it and dicing it and dissecting it, what you hear me say today needs to be taken in the greater context of the whole thing. Now, a guy like John MacArthur, he is a man that has written prolifically on the Bible. I mean, he's got commentary. And believe me, I don't hesitate to take John MacArthur to task. I have done that. In fact, we had a 2-hour program where we had a transcript of his opening session at the Shepherds Conference, the 2007 Shepherds Conference, and we basically ripped him up. Steve, because the title of his message was Why Every Self-Respecting Calvinist is Premillennial. And it didn't make any sense at all. And so he needs to be held accountable if he's going to say stuff like that. And we had a long transcript. So, I mean, we know the context of what John MacArthur's saying. But having studied his commentaries and being familiar with him, and granted, somebody that I don't disagree or don't agree with on many issues, especially his dispensationalism, I think, have a responsibility to look a little bit deeper and see, well, what does he teach on civil disobedience? Is there any place for civil disobedience?
I'm just going to read what he said again. I think it's so severe that everything just, the vortex centers on this. This is the epicenter of the earthquake. Now listen to this. It doesn't matter whether your ruler is Caesar, Herod, Pilate, Felix, Festus, Agrippa, Stalin, Hitler, Winston Churchill, Bill Clinton. It doesn't matter who it is. He says, be subject. You teach them to be subject. And once again, that comes back to who's in charge, who's the authority. It comes back to it's all about Jesus. Jesus is Lord of Lords, King of Kings. He is sovereign. The front page of that magazine that you're looking at there right now.
Leatherneck Magazine.
Leatherneck Magazine is a Marine Corps magazine. Now, I was president of the United States Marine Corps Reserve Officers Association for San Diego just a few years ago, and I interact with the Marines. In fact, I had a company formed at the request of the Marines. My company was teaching Arabic and Islamic philosophy to the Marines going over and conducted the Battle of Fallujah. The picture that you're looking at there is pictures of Marines conducting operation against civilians. The guy's laying on the ground with the guy's foot on the back of the civilian. He's playing the part of a civilian. Mm-hmm. So I know that in the near future, as Islamic law is coming in, as the fracturing of our once Christian-based republic, and I have tons of evidence that it was based on Jesus Christ from Alexis de Tocqueville, Moby Dick of all things, and other books of that nature. I believe we're under judgment because of what John MacArthur wrote there. When I go out on the streets, when I go to federal court, when I talk to city attorneys, they tell me that, hey, you have to obey us because it says in the Bible you have to obey the civil magistrate. ACLU types quote Romans 13 to me, so I'm familiar with that. One of the reasons why we can't get people out there to stop the heinous crime of abortion is because 45 million of our citizens are already dead. Normally, if you're going to do a revolution, and yes, I do believe in revolutions if they're done properly. Once again, my degree is in political science. I believe that the American Revolution was done in accordance with the Bible. I believe it comes right out of 2 Chronicles 22, 1 through 15, where Athaliah, the wicked queen, murdered all of her grandsons. One was rescued by one of the leaders, and he worked in conjunction with a high priest. He put together a shadow government. When the boy reached 7 or 12 years old, they brought him in, crowned him king after all of his brothers and cousins had been murdered by his grandmother. And then she cried out and called them traitors. And they said, yes, traitor is the right word. And they took her, gave her due process, and cut her head off. The Westminster Confession was written at the time that Oliver Cromwell was waging civil war against Charles I, the Catholic king. Many people don't understand Charles I, but all of our First Amendment rights, all of our Constitution, Declaration of Independence comes out of Oliver Cromwell. The Westminster Divines supported Oliver Cromwell in his civil war against Charles I, who was the dutifully appointed king. He was the authority, but he had exceeded his authority, and that's another very important word. Children have to obey their parents, and wives have to submit to their husbands, but only as long as it's a lawful authority, only as long as it's a lawful order. Husbands and parents have jurisdictions. As a father, I can tell my son to pick up his room and things of that nature, but I can't go out and tell him to steal for me or beat up people for me. Then I have exceeded my authority. I'm not an authority once I do that. A general is an authority only as long as he's within his jurisdiction. He can tell me to go out and get killed, and I will, and I would have, and I've been in that situation. But once he exceeds his jurisdiction, he's no longer an authority. And when Cromwell opposed Charles I, he did that with the blessings of Owens and Gillespie and the rest of the Westminster divines. And if you look up in the Westminster Confession or the Baptist Confession of 1689, it says the identical same words that Calvin said at the end in his 100th aphorism. So once again, I think John MacArthur has exceeded his jurisdiction. He's a pastor, and he is telling people to obey murderers, and I think he's the one who's disobeying, not me or people who would oppose him.
Okay, but there's a difference between obeying a murderer and obeying the command of that murderer to murder. In other words, you have Caesar. Caesar was a murderer. Nero Caesar was in power at the time Romans was written, the time Paul wrote the book of Romans. He was a murderer, clearly. He was murdering Christians. But yet Paul says that we are to obey him.
And that goes back to jurisdiction once again. As long as he's taxing us and doing things that, putting speed limits and things of that nature in accordance with the Ten Commandments, there's no problem there, and we obey him. But once he exceeds his authority, he's a power, but he does not have authority, and we are to resist him.
When he exceeds, give me an example of what you mean by when he exceeds his authority.
Sure. The other day when I was at Earth Day, we hung up signs about the Shahada, because Islamic law is introduced and is working in America right now. And the Shahada is the central tenet of Islam, just like the two great commandments are the central tenet of Christianity. And the Shahada says something like this: there is no God but Allah. Muhammad is his messenger. The sword is the message. The message is convert, submit, or die. And the officer in charge, I can't give his rank, at Earth Day, where there was 100,000 people and we had at least 10,000 Muslims and people we witnessed to, terrorists there. The officer in charge demanded that I take down the sign. We had coordinated all this. This was like our 8th or 9th year of going to the mayor, city council, police chief, city attorney, and coordinating all this stuff. But this officer was stepping beyond his jurisdiction. He did not have jurisdiction to come in and tell me to take down that sign because the First Amendment gives me that right. So he was overstepping his authority, so he was not in a position of authority. So I very politely said to him, sir, you're outside of your jurisdiction. You have no authority to tell me this. We have coordinated this with the city of San Diego, and the First Amendment gives me the right to do that. So unless you can cite me some exact code and ordinance that supersedes the First Amendment and what the mayor of San Diego has done, then there's nothing more to talk about.
And that's what Paul does when he's being beaten.
Exactly.
He appeals to his Roman citizenship,
exactly.
And he says that you are unlawfully detaining me and beating me.
Exactly.
And then you see the response that Roman guard has.
And he actually pushed him. He wouldn't. There was 2 occurrences. In one occurrence, the city father said, "Oh, go away, and we'll forget the whole thing." And Paul said, "No, I demand due process." And our group, our motto is proclaiming the gospel and Christ's dominion through due process, occupying until Christ returns. We send that out on our letterhead to the city attorney, the mayor, city council, city manager, and when we go to federal court, that's read in there. So authority is very important here, and authority ceases to exist when somebody tells us to do something that's against the Ten Commandments.
Okay. Or tells you to do something that is not a law in and of itself, like take down your sign.
Because those laws have to be written in accordance with the Ten Commandments. For example, when I said the law of Temecula might tell you, for example, when we did a mosque in El Cajon, we were cited, not arrested, for putting gospel literature on cars in front of the mosque. So the police came out there, and I explained to them under the First Amendment, et cetera, et cetera. They insisted they were going to cite me. They made me take all the literatures off the cars. We won about $70,000 in that case. At the point in time that the officer told me to stop doing that, he was a power, but he was not an authority. The courts came back and agreed with me and said, you had power, you misused it. Mr. Kline had the authority, he did correctly. And so as Paul did, as a model, then we would disobey Hitler. We would disobey Stalin if we were Corrie ten Boom and Hitler, his Gestapo came in and said, Corrie, you got to turn in those Jewish people. Then under that time, we could say, no, we're not going to do it. If it costs us our life, then so be it. To gain is, how does it go with Paul?
Yeah.
To die as Christ, to live as whatever.
To die is gain, to live as Christ.
So we have to define what is lawful order, what is authority. This is where the founding fathers, who were all Calvinists and who followed the Westminster Confession, and they appealed, they created a shadow government. For example, your wife's Filipino. When the Japanese conquered the Philippines, who was the government? It was the Japanese. But the Filipino resisted them, just like the French resistance did against the Germans, because that was a power but not a lawful authority.
Okay, so you, in the story that you gave us, you still made a decision to remove those leaflets?
I did it because I knew it was going to go to trial, and being experienced and following Paul's example, I did that, and it worked out very well, and it actually gave us strength to our case. If I hadn't taken the flyers off, it would go into a different form of law, and we wouldn't have won any money. And so Romans 10:13, call upon the name of the Lord, how will they hear but by the preaching? That's our whole effort. We're doing the First Amendment, trying to keep it alive as hate speech from the Muslims, from the Mormons, from the abortionists, is trying to shut us down so we cannot give the gospel anymore. That's what our whole ministry is about. Hate speech is all about shutting you and missionaries down so that you can't preach the gospel. And I know a lot of romantic people say, oh, persecution is good. I don't mind if I get arrested. Point one, I've never seen any of those people arrested. I've never been arrested, but I go out and do this stuff properly. Point number two, how do you witness to people in solitary confinement? Point number three, if all these people have given their blood for us so that we can share the gospel, then we are remiss by not protecting that. How many people will go to hell, almost in Arminianism, if we're not out there sharing the gospel?
But we know God is sovereign, right? But that doesn't relieve us from our responsibilities.
And it's interesting because we're talking about this, and it's almost like the difference between Calvinism and Arminianism. Who we obey, who we don't obey. God is sovereign. God elects. God also tells us we have to do His law. We're not under man's law unless it's in accordance with God's law, and He will hold us accountable. And interestingly enough, the very last clause of the Declaration of Independence, the Founding Fathers say that we submit our case before the Supreme Judge of the world. We will plead our case there because they're not exactly sure if they're doing right or wrong. They know they're going to stand in front of Jesus, and they're ready to do it.
All right, one of the examples that you often give, we've talked about this before, is the Nuremberg trials.
Yes.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about how civil disobedience plays into what those German officers or those Germans that were in control, the ones that had the power, how this all plays together with Nazi Germany as an example?
The Supreme Court justice who was tasked with trying the Nazi officers by Truman was opposed by the English, the French, and the Russians because the law of Germany said that they could kill the Jews.
Okay.
Which is more or less what John MacArthur...
The commander-in-chief said...
Which is more or less what John MacArthur says.
Well, I cringe every time you say that because I've read John MacArthur's position now, in addition to the context that we have, and John MacArthur's not saying that.
Well, you could cringe, but I'll continue on with the Nuremberg trial.
Okay. I mean, I think we need to be careful. Do you consider John MacArthur a brother?
I consider that the wounds of a friend are good, and I hope that I have wounded him in a biblical sense.
Okay.
So that he
but
won't...
I'm pointing out to you that you've only revealed in that transcript a limited portion of his whole position. There's more to his position than that.
There's more to his position to that.
He does make room for civil disobedience.
All I could quote right now is hearsay evidence. If you want, I can get primary factors of people who have been abused because of his teaching. That issue there, I'll close the subject there. I apologize if you cringe, but it's good for you. It makes you think. It is so severe.
Let me just tell you, it's a good thing I like you, Steve, because I'd be down your throat right now if I didn't like you. Believe me, my wife can testify to that.
So one of the reasons why I wanted to be here face-to-face with Gene is because I knew he would jump down to my throat on the telephone, but he wouldn't if I was here face-to-face. If you knew me, you'd know why. Okay, the Nuremberg trial. The French, the English, and the Russians all opposed us and said it was merely their law. They were only following their law, so we have no right to take them to court and try them. Our Supreme Court justice went back to international law to a guy named Hugo Grotius, an Arminian, who had to flee Holland because the Calvinists were going to murder him. And international law, that's okay, international law, according to Grotius, the father of international law, as James Madison called him, and the founding fathers took him as derivative or authoritative, stated that international law is based upon the Golden Rule. Now, that sounds pretty insane to our ears today. Could you imagine going to a case today in the world court and saying that I'm going to try, convict, and hang these 11 guys based on the Golden Rule? But that's exactly what happened in the Nuremberg trial. And to sum it up, what happened was our Supreme Court justice said these 4 things. You won't find them in print, but it's the overall inference. And I have the book, The Nuremberg Trial, right here, which cost me $75. And it's interesting in there.
This is a transcript of the trial?
Yeah, of his opening and closing statements. When MacArthur says you have to obey Hitler and Stalin, it's interesting in one of the depositions, I believe it was Martin Bormann, they said to him, why did you have to destroy the Christian church? Today in revisionism, many people say Hitler was a Christian and the Germans were Christians who murdered all the Jews, etc. But just the opposites in the transcripts. Bormann said we had to destroy the church because the church would resist us in killing the Jews and we couldn't start World War II. And we knew that the church would oppose us, civil disobedience against us. Therefore, we had to destroy Martin Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's also interesting to me that the communists, along with the Nazis, understand the power of the church. In Red China, if you become a Christian, or in Vietnam, or the Muslims in Saudi Arabia, you become a Christian, you're an enemy of the state. That, to me, speaks volumes and volumes of the power of the gospel and the power to change lives and the power to heal and the power to bring liberty, the liberty of God under his 10 commandments. If you're only under the 10 commandments, you have a lot of liberty. If you're under the current laws that we have in America, you're under volume after volume after volume. You're enslaved. But in any case, back to the Nuremberg trial. This is the 4 things that came out of the inferred portion of the trial. Number 1, to the Nazis who were hung, because you obeyed your civil law. Number 2, because you obeyed your civil magistrate Adolf Hitler. Number 3, because you did not disobey your civil law. And number 4, because you did not disobey your civil magistrate Adolf Hitler. I will try you, I will convict you, and I will hang you, and I will base it on the Golden Rule.
And they did.
And they did.
And I was wondering, in the situation, have you looked into the relevance concerning Saddam Hussein? Because he's the leader of his nation. So did they hold him accountable? Did the UN hold him accountable? Is that how it worked?
I think you're throwing me a red herring.
Okay.
But
I mean, because they hanged him also. But yet he was the dictator. He was the one making the laws.
I know you too well, Gene. I think you're bringing in Brian Tolman and just warfare theory. Are you?
No.
Okay.
No, I'm not. I wasn't thinking about that.
While I trained the Marines to go over to Iraq to kill people, to do it in a Christian fashion, which I know sounds insane to the modern ear, but I do believe in Christian warfare, and I do believe that you do love your neighbor and you do love your enemy, and I experienced it firsthand after fighting people all night long and then healing their wounds and feeding them and treating them with love. It's a restraint. It goes back to Matthew, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, under God that which is God's. That was the first time in the history of the world that God ordained government, and he limited it at the same time. Caesar is under God's authority, and I think that's so misunderstood today. And having read MacArthur later on in that same article, he basically says willy-nilly obey Caesar, which makes no sense to me at all. And it goes back to it's all about Jesus. It's all about Jesus' sovereignty. It's all about Jesus' dominion. It's all about me standing before Jesus sooner or later. And now we have Sharia law, Islamic law coming into the United States. Federal loans provide for alms or zakat, which has been proven is used illegally by the Saudi Arabians to fund terrorism. And in Canada, Sharia law is now part of family court. And we have communities like in Anaheim, California, and Dearborn, Michigan, which want to become Islamic controlled. And over the next 50 years, I will become a prophet right now, and you can stone me in 50 years because I'll be 106 years old. If I'm wrong, I'll be dead. It won't matter. But I prophesy in 50 years.
You just see, this is what happens when you move to Utah.
I lived in Utah. Everybody becomes a prophet. Now, I prophesy that within 50 years, you will have large communities in the United States that will be under Islamic law and Christians trying to live under that law. And it's going to be cognitive dissonance, holding two opposing opinions or points of view at the same time. And that's just a formula for disaster.
Okay, we're running out of time, so let me get your thoughts on one final quote from MacArthur's transcript. He says, "You see, the church has one mission. We are a nation of priests, and a priest had one simple function, to bring people to God, to usher them into His presence. It's the only thing we're in the world to do. Frankly, if people die in a communist government or a democracy, it really doesn't matter if they end up in hell. If they die under a tyrant or a benevolent dictator, it doesn't matter if they end up in hell. If they die believing that homosexuality is wrong or believing that homosexuality is right and end up in hell, it really doesn't matter." End quote. What do you think about that?
Can you read the first 10 or 15 words again, and then I'll politely ask you to stop at that point in time?
You see, the church has one mission. We are a nation of priests.
Perfect. That one mission, we are a nation of priests, and according to the Great Commission, we're supposed to go out and preach to all nations and make disciples of all nations. And I would say that Mr. MacArthur is remiss in his statement, and that if you do have the ability to preach the gospel, which we do here in the United States, you will have a higher percentage of people going to heaven. You will be able to go out, you can call it Arminianism if you want to. You'll be able to reach more people will get saved, more people will live in a land of fewer laws. And once again, if you're in Russia or if you're in Red China, the percentages over there, while the church may be growing, it's not growing at the rate that the United States church grew. A good example is go see the movie Saving Private Ryan, or looking at the graves from where Grace is from in the Philippines of the Bataan Death March. Over every grave you will see a cross. And I think that speaks volumes and volumes. And I just fear for my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren, when Islam is rapidly taking over here, they will have less and less chance to hear the gospel. Romans 10:13, how do they get saved? Why are you starting a church here in Temecula? So that you could preach, you could reach, you could teach, and people will go up to heaven because of that. So I think John MacArthur, he is remiss in what he has written, and I think it is so severe what he wrote that it cannot be overlooked. And it's not, if it's inconsistent with what he wrote in other places, the severity of what he wrote here supersedes what he wrote in other places.
All right, Steve. I appreciate you coming into the studio today for the interview. And I'm sure our listening audience will benefit from this. They'll be able to, I think, give it some thought, because there is some very thought-provoking material that we discussed today. And we need to be clear. We need to be clear in our minds. We need to be clear biblically. We need to be clear in our own conscience. What is our obligation as Christians concerning those that are in authority over us? All right, we'll be back, Lord willing, tomorrow evening, Friday evening at 6 p.m. for Open Phones Friday. Until then, may God continue to bless the study of His Word.